I've always been a person who enjoyed the peace and quiet of the outdoors, especially in the deep woods. There's something about being far from civilization that brings a certain level of calm to the mind. That's why, when I was invited on a weekend camping trip by some old college friends, I didn't hesitate to join them. We were heading to a remote area deep in the Appalachian Mountains, an isolated spot I had never heard of, but it sounded like the perfect place for a weekend of hiking and bonfires. It was early fall, the kind of season where the leaves are just starting to change colors, but there's still enough warmth to keep the chill at bay. The drive to the campsite was long, and by the time we arrived, dusk had already settled in. We pitched our tents and gathered around the fire, exchanging stories and jokes under the canopy of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly above us. It felt like the kind of night where nothing could go wrong, but that's when the first odd thing happened. I remember hearing something that didn't quite belong in the usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves, a distant sound like footsteps crunching in the underbrush. It was too deliberate to be an animal. I brushed it off as someone from another nearby camp, and nobody else seemed to hear it. We carried on with our evening, oblivious to what was already lurking in the darkness. The first sign that something wasn't right came the next morning. I woke up to find the fire pit had been disturbed. Ashes were scattered around in a way that suggested someone or something had been messing with it, but none of us had moved from our spots, and no one had left the campsite during the night. Confused but not overly alarmed, we just assumed an animal had gotten into the fire pit. It wasn't until we ventured deeper into the woods that I started to feel unease. We hiked a few miles into the forest, following a narrow trail that wound through thick trees. The further we went, the more silent everything became. No birds, no wind. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We pressed on, laughing and talking, but the oppressive silence was starting to gnaw at me. Then, as we were nearing a clearing, one of my friends, Brian, suddenly stopped in his tracks. He looked out ahead, his face pale. "Do you guys see that?" he asked, his voice shaking. We all followed his gaze, but the clearing was empty. Just an expanse of trees, some rocks, and the faint remnants of an old, weathered cabin. But as I stared longer, I noticed something strange. The air seemed to shimmer unnaturally, as if the very space around the cabin was warped, distorted. I took a few steps forward to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. A figure, half hidden in the shadows of the cabin, standing perfectly still. It was tall and thin, draped in what looked like tattered clothing. The figure had no face, just a dark void where the features should be. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, not daring to take my eyes off it. Before anyone could respond, the figure slowly raised its arm, pointing directly at me. In that instant, I felt something cold and heavy wash over me, a deep, primal fear that chilled me to my very core. It was as if the forest itself was aware of me, watching me, and that thing, the figure, was its messenger. I stumbled back, my legs shaking. "We need to leave, now." Brian, looking pale as a ghost, turned and started running. The rest of us followed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from behind. The woods felt suffocating, like they were closing in on us with every step we took. When we finally made it back to camp, we were all in a state of panic. We packed up our things in record time, but it wasn't until we were ready to leave that we realized something worse was happening. Our car, well, my car had been tampered with. The tires were slashed and the windows were cracked. Whoever or whatever had been stalking us had made sure we couldn't leave easily. That's when the real terror began. We decided to stay put for the night, hoping help would come in the morning. We lit a fire again, but this time the warmth did little to comfort us. The woods felt alive, not with the normal sounds of animals, but with something far older and darker. There was a presence in the air, something that made my skin crawl. We sat around the fire, talking in hushed tones when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. It wasn't the growl of a bear or any animal I knew. This sound was wrong. It felt like it was coming from deep within the earth itself, from the very roots of the trees. And then the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't distant. They were close, too close. The leaves rustled, and we all turned to look in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing. "Who's out there?" I called into the darkness, my voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything went eerily silent. But then, the ground beneath us began to tremble, like something massive was moving underground. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, shifting, bending, waiting. Suddenly, the trees around us started to sway, even though there was no wind. And then, just like that, the fire went out. One moment we had flames, and the next, all that remained was darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic began to set in. We were surrounded, isolated, and now completely blind in the dark. And then I heard the whisper. It was soft at first, a barely audible murmur that seemed to come from every direction. The voice was not human. It was an ancient language, guttural and deep, like something older than time itself. I couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear. Something was calling us. The whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping, until it felt like the trees themselves were speaking to us. There was a sense of dread in those whispers, of something malevolent and powerful waiting to claim us. "Stay close," I whispered to my friends, my voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of voices. "Whatever happens, do not leave my side." But even as I said those words, I could hear the sound of footsteps again, much closer this time, and they weren't human. My heart raced as I turned around to see a shadow moving through the trees. It was large, far larger than any person, and it had no shape, just a mass of darkness, shifting and flowing like liquid. The smell that filled the air was nauseating, like decay and earth. I heard a scream, Brian's voice, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone. The fire was gone. The trees stood tall, silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew. I knew I had been marked, and the forest had claimed its due. I was the only one who had survived, but I couldn't remember how. To this day, I don't know if what happened that night was real or if I had simply lost my mind. But I know this much. Whatever I saw, whatever was out there in the deep woods, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything from this world. And it's still out there, waiting for its next victim.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Not in the way people talk about them, wandering spirits or restless souls seeking vengeance. I'd always chalked those stories up to overactive imaginations and old traditions. But that all changed when I took a solo trip to a cabin deep in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. I had rented the place for a week, wanting some time away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and I figured it would be the perfect spot to clear my head. The locals had warned me about the area, though. They spoke of strange things in the woods, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, even an old tale about a family that had mysteriously disappeared years ago. I'd listened politely, but I didn't take it seriously. After all, small-town legends were nothing more than folklore, right? I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that made your breath visible but didn't quite freeze you. The cabin was small but charming, with wood paneling on the walls and a crackling fireplace. I unpacked my bags, made a quick dinner, and settled in with a book. The sun had set by the time I finished eating, and the shadows in the trees grew long outside the window. It was around 9 p.m. when the first noise startled me. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on glass, echoed through the cabin. I froze, listening intently. It came from the front door. I got up, cautiously approaching the door, but when I opened it, nothing was there. I stepped outside onto the porch, looking around in the dim light, but all I could see were trees and the faint outline of the dirt road that led to the cabin. I told myself it was probably just a branch scraping against the wood or some animal passing by. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I locked all the doors and windows, though I wasn't sure why. The house felt off, like something was watching me from just beyond the trees. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the uneasy sensation clung to me like a second skin. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't a peaceful rest. I dreamed of the woods, dark, twisted trees that seemed to reach toward me with gnarled fingers. And in the distance, something moved. Something fast. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding. The next morning, I was determined to shake off the previous night's strange events. I went for a hike along a trail nearby, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, tall pines, the sound of birds chirping, the smell of earth and pine needles. I walked for a couple of hours, taking in the beauty of it all. But when I tried to head back to the cabin, I realized something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same. The trees seemed to be in different positions, and the path had become narrower and overgrown. It was as if the woods were shifting, rearranging themselves. I tried to retrace my steps, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more disoriented I became. The familiar landmarks I'd passed on my way out were nowhere to be seen. Panic began to set in. I started calling out, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. But all that answered me was the echo of my own voice. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. An old, dilapidated house, hidden deep in the forest. It wasn't on any map, and I had no memory of walking past it. The house was weathered and abandoned, its windows boarded up, but there was something wrong about it. Something unnatural. My gut told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the house, my feet crunching on the overgrown grass. The door creaked open when I pushed it. Inside, the air was musty and stale, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. The house was eerily silent, but I felt it, the presence of something. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the walls themselves were watching me. I stepped further inside, my flashlight casting long shadows across the room. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the wallpaper was peeling. But there was one thing that caught my attention, a large portrait hanging above the fireplace. The face in the painting was unnervingly familiar. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. I couldn't place her, but there was a deep sense of recognition, like I had seen her before. And then it hit me. Her eyes. They were the same eyes I'd seen in my dream the night before. Before I could process this, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house. I spun around, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could hear something, soft, whispering voices coming from the walls. They seemed to be speaking in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. I turned toward the stairs, desperate to find an escape. But when I looked up, I saw something at the top of the stairs. A shadow. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless at the landing. It was the same figure from my dream, the same one I had seen darting through the trees. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as the figure slowly descended the stairs, its form shifting and flickering like it wasn't entirely part of this world. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in front of me. The figure stopped just a few feet away. It didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The air around me became thick with dread. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me in the cold, silent darkness of the abandoned house. I ran, raced toward the door, and finally forced it open. My heart was pounding in my chest as I fled back into the woods, not daring to look behind me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found my way back to the cabin. The sun was setting, and the woods felt different. The trees loomed taller, more menacing. I locked the doors, bolted the windows, and sat in the corner, not daring to sleep. That night, I heard the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder as the hours passed. They called my name, soft, persistent. And in the darkness, I saw her, the woman from the painting. Her hollow eyes stared at me from the edge of the trees outside. The next morning, I packed my things and left without a word, driving as fast as I could down the winding roads. I never went back to that cabin, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear the whispers, and I know that whatever was in those woods, that thing, that presence, is still waiting for me.
Next story.
It was late autumn, and the air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and decaying wood. The days had grown shorter, and the once lush forest had started to lose its vibrant colors. I had been hiking in the deep woods for hours, just looking for a break from the chaos of everyday life. I needed solitude, peace, and More than anything, I craved the silence that only the woods could offer. I didn't think I was lost, at least not yet, but something didn't feel right. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. There were no birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, not even the occasional breeze whispering through the trees. It was as though the woods themselves had gone still, holding their breath. That's when I heard it, a distant sound, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. At first I thought it was just the wind, but there was no breeze. I paused, straining my ears, trying to identify the source. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, more distinct. "Help me." I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. The voice was soft, fragile, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had come out here for peace, but now I felt anything but calm. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to find out what it was. Maybe it was someone in danger, or worse, someone who needed help. I began walking toward the sound, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. The trees grew thicker, their twisted branches casting long, gnarled shadows on the forest floor. The air grew colder, a chill seeping through my jacket. I pushed forward, despite the growing sense of dread that clung to me like a heavy fog. The whisper came again, clearer this time, as if it were right behind me. "Help me." I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the vast emptiness of the forest, stretching out in every direction. The only thing I could hear was my own panicked breathing and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, or the wind had carried a sound from far off. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. This was something else. I walked faster now, my feet crunching through the dry leaves beneath me. I had to find the source of that voice. It was almost like an obsession, like something had taken hold of my mind and was pulling me deeper into the woods. Then out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the distance, a silhouette standing motionless between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks, my blood running cold. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to sway gently despite the stillness of the air. At first, I thought it was just another tree, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. But as I stared, I could see it. There was something wrong with it. It wasn't a tree. It wasn't human. It was something far darker, more malevolent. The figure took a step forward, its long limbs jerking unnaturally with every movement. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was coming toward me. Its movement unsettlingly fluid, like something not quite human. The whisper grew louder, now a desperate cry. "Help me, please." I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the roots of the trees. The figure's face remained hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes, cold, empty eyes, boring into me. I turned to run, my heart hammering in my chest, but the woods around me seemed to close in. The trees grew thicker, their branches stretching out like claws, trapping me in this nightmarish place. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I sprinted through the forest, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the presence that followed me. I could hear the whisper, now a steady, pleading chant that echoed through the trees surrounding me. "Help me, help me, help me." It was everywhere. The trees, the rocks, the very ground beneath me, everything seemed to be whispering, urging me to turn around, to confront whatever was stalking me. But I couldn't. I was too terrified to look back. All I wanted was to escape, to get out of the woods and back to safety. But the deeper I ran, the worse it got. I lost all sense of direction. The path I had been following seemed to disappear, replaced by an endless maze of trees that all looked the same. My legs ached, my breath was ragged, and I felt as if the very forest itself was trying to swallow me whole. I tripped and fell, crashing to the ground with a scream, my body jolting as I hit the earth. When I looked up, I saw it again, the figure standing just beyond the reach of my vision, watching me with its empty, soulless eyes. It was too close now, too close to run. I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my system, but my legs felt heavy as though they were made of stone. My vision blurred, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was hallucinating, if this was just some twisted nightmare my mind had conjured. But then I heard it. The voice, now full of anguish, filled the air around me. "Help me, please." I looked to my left and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, hunched and twisted, stood beside a tree, its face obscured by shadows. It was the same as the other one, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was no longer a person. It was something darker, something otherworldly. And it was moving toward me, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. I turned and ran, stumbling blindly through the forest, but no matter how fast I went, the whispers grew louder, the figures drawing closer. It was as if the entire forest was alive, feeding on my fear. I could feel them all around me, their presence pressing in, suffocating me. There was no escape. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning. But eventually, I stumbled into a clearing, a small patch of light in the midst of the darkness. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a figure I recognized. A woman, hunched and broken, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her mouth moved, though no sound came out. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by some unseen force. The whisper came again, louder than ever. "Help me." And then I understood. The voice I had been hearing, the one that had drawn me deeper into the woods, wasn't a plea for help. It was a trap, a lure, a trick. The forest had called me here, and now it wanted me to join them. I turned to run again, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against my arm, sending a shock of cold through my body. My vision blurred, and I felt a pull like something was dragging me down into the earth. The woods were closing in around me, the trees now alive, their branches wrapping around me, squeezing the life out of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, in the final moments of my consciousness, I heard the voice again, closer now, almost in my ear. "Help me." The darkness took me.
Next story.
It was just a short hike, a way to get away from the constant noise of the city. I had been itching for some peace and quiet, a break from the fast-paced grind of everyday life. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the dense woods as I set off into the trees, breathing in the earthy scent of moss and pine. I was alone, my backpack containing only the essentials: water, a flashlight, and a few snacks. I didn't plan to stay long, just a couple of hours to unwind. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, something felt off. The trees were taller than I remembered, their thick trunks towering over me like silent sentinels. The sun, once warm, seemed to fade faster than it should. A chill settled into the air, and the forest began to feel eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just a deep, almost unnatural stillness. I shook it off at first. It's just the wilderness, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But then I heard something. At first, it was just a faint rustle in the distance, like footsteps on dry leaves. I paused, looking around, but saw nothing. I shrugged and kept walking. The path had become narrow, and the trees were so close together that they blocked out most of the remaining sunlight. It was getting darker now, and I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps. They were closer this time, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears. The sound came from behind me, just out of sight. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a hiker or a hunter, but there was nothing. The path was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely loud in the quiet. There was no answer. I looked around, my senses tingling with an odd, prickling awareness. Something wasn't right. The forest felt wrong. I began walking again, faster this time. The uneasy feeling grew, and I could feel my pulse quicken. The footsteps followed me, always just a few paces behind. No matter how fast I walked, no matter how many times I turned around to check, I never saw anyone. But I could hear them, unmistakable in the growing darkness. My pace quickened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The woods seemed to close in around me, the path twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. I was losing my bearings, and that was when I started to panic. The footsteps weren't just behind me anymore. They were all around me, circling me like some invisible predator. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling now. But again, no response. Only the sound of footsteps. Too many to be one person. Too quiet to be the work of animals. It was as if the forest itself was alive, moving in sync with me, surrounding me, trapping me. I pulled my flashlight from my backpack, clicking it on, but the beam cut through the trees only for a few feet before being swallowed by the darkness. I felt the pressure in the air shift, a heaviness that weighed down on me like a physical force. The woods seemed to stretch out endlessly in all directions, as if they had no end. And then there it was, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light. I froze. My heart stopped. It was a tall man, or at least it looked like a man. But something was wrong. His features were indistinct, like a shadow in the moonlight, his body shifting and distorting as if it wasn't entirely solid. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him, towering between the trees, his posture unnaturally still. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air was thick with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, the figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. I backed away, my hands shaking, but the figure continued to move forward, its presence somehow pressing in on me, forcing me to stay where I was. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, it continued to move closer, its shape becoming clearer, and I could feel a deep, bone-chilling cold wash over me as it approached. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. The figure seemed to grow taller with every step it took, its form becoming more indistinct, more like a shifting mass of darkness than a person. I turned and ran. My feet flew over the uneven ground, heart pounding in my chest, breath ragged. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I could feel the presence, close, right behind me, as though it was reaching out to grab me, to pull me back into the shadows. The forest was a blur as I sprinted, trying to find the path I had come from. But no matter which direction I turned, it all seemed the same. The trees twisted around me like some unholy maze, trapping me in their gnarled branches. The dark shape was still there, just out of my vision, but I could feel it closing in. I stumbled through the underbrush, my legs heavy and aching, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let whatever that thing was catch me. A tree root caught my foot and I fell hard to the ground, scraping my hands on the rough bark. I pushed myself up, panic surging through me, and then I saw it. The figure was standing in front of me now, so close I could feel the cold emanating from it, a palpable chill that froze my very soul. It was no longer just a man, it was a thing, shapeless, a mass of shadows and darkness swirling like smoke in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. I could hear it now, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere surrounding me. Not alone. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, as if the very air had turned to stone, holding me in place. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, pressing in on me, and the next, it was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence of the woods in its wake. I don't know how I made it out of the forest. My memory of the next few hours is a blur, just flashes of light, trees rushing past, and the overwhelming urge to run, to get away. When I finally emerged from the woods, it was well past midnight. The forest was quiet again, like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. I haven't gone back to those woods. In fact, I don't even think about them. But sometimes when the night is too quiet and the wind doesn't stir the trees, I can still hear it, the whispering voice, the faintest echo of footsteps behind me. And I know one thing for certain, I was never alone in those woods.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway with a few friends in the deep woods, a break from the grind of everyday life. My buddy Mike had been talking about this spot for weeks, some hidden gem of a campsite in the middle of nowhere, far off any trail. "It'll be perfect," he said. "Just you, me, and the woods." I should have known better than to trust him. We packed our gear and headed out on a Friday afternoon, just after work. The kind of day where the sun lingers long enough to make you think the weekend will last forever. We drove for hours, the city fading behind us as the landscape turned darker, the trees thicker. Eventually, Mike pulled off the main road and onto a barely visible dirt path. I didn't ask too many questions. He was the outdoorsy one, and I was just along for the ride. We arrived as dusk settled in and the woods swallowed us whole. Mike set up the tent while I gathered wood for the fire. The crackling flames were a comfort, lighting up the shadows just enough to reassure me. I remember sitting there, staring into the fire, thinking about how peaceful everything felt. It wasn't until later that the peace was shattered. It started as a soft sound in the distance, like a whisper carried by the wind. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just the forest, maybe some wildlife. But as the night wore on, it grew louder, faint at first, then undeniable. Footsteps, not the kind made by deer or small animals, but something heavier, something human. I looked at Mike. He didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in the can of beans he was eating. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. Mike looked up, scanning the tree line. "Probably just some animals. You know how it is out here." But I wasn't so sure. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic to be an animal. They stopped, then started again, moving closer to our camp. "Maybe we should head back to the car," I suggested, but Mike shook his head, clearly annoyed. "Come on, man. It's just the woods. People get weird out here." I didn't like it, but I didn't argue. Instead, I forced myself to relax, tossing another log on the fire and trying to focus on anything other than the growing unease crawling up my spine. But the sound didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. I'd always been skeptical of ghost stories, of things that go bump in the night. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got up and moved closer to the fire, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were right outside our camp now, just beyond the circle of light, and there was no way in hell they were just animals. Mike stood up, wiping his mouth. "All right, you're creeping me out now. Let's go take a look." We grabbed our flashlights and ventured a few yards into the darkness, the beam of light cutting through the trees like a knife. The woods felt different now, colder, as if the air itself had thickened. Mike made a joke about how there were probably people just screwing with us, but I could tell his voice wasn't as confident as it had been earlier. We walked for what seemed like hours, the footsteps still trailing behind us, just out of reach. Every so often, we'd stop, flash the light around, but there was nothing. No one. "I'm telling you, it's nothing," Mike said, his voice shaking just a little. "Let's head back." We turned, but something was different. The forest didn't look the same as it had just minutes ago. The trees seemed wrong, like they were leaning in closer, watching us. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and that's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, barely visible in the shadows. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't human, not like us. Mike didn't see it at first, but I could feel the tension in the air, like everything had shifted. Then he turned, his flashlight catching something in the distance, and his face went pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Its outline was jagged, unnatural, almost as if it didn't belong in the world we knew. We backed away slowly, not wanting to turn our backs on whatever it was, but unable to move forward either. It was like the air had turned to stone, making every step harder than the last. Then the sound of footsteps came again, but now it was closer. The figure was no longer in the distance. It was right there, just behind us, but we couldn't bring ourselves to look. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. We ran. The woods became a blur of motion, branches scratching at my face as we sprinted back toward the camp, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. The closer we got to the clearing, the more intense the feeling of dread became, like something was following us, but we couldn't see it. We crashed through the underbrush, finally bursting out into the open space where our tent still stood, the fire barely flickering. Mike was already at the tent, throwing everything into the back of the car. His hands were shaking, his face pale. "Get in the car," he barked, not even looking at me. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed what I could and followed him, not caring about the gear or the tent. I just needed to leave. We drove for what felt like hours, not speaking, just focusing on the road and the sound of our breathing. The air in the car felt lighter, like we had escaped something, but the tension lingered, like we were still being hunted. That night, we didn't stop until we were well out of the woods. We pulled into a small motel at the edge of the next town and barely spoke as we checked in. We were too shaken, too aware of what we'd left behind. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know what followed us, or why. But I know it wasn't human. The woods are full of things people aren't meant to understand, and I learned that the hard way. Maybe we were never meant to find that campsite, or maybe it found us. Either way, I'll never go back to those woods again. The woods have a way of hiding things, of keeping secrets, secrets that, once uncovered, are better left forgotten.
Next story.
It was late October when my friends and I decided to take a road trip through the mountains, the kind of trip people take to get away from the world, to disconnect, breathe in the crisp fall air, and explore the rugged beauty of the wilderness. We weren't far from civilization, but it felt like the kind of place where anything could happen, and that's what drew us there. We had no specific destination. The idea was to just get lost, wander along some back roads and find a campsite. Mike had brought along his vintage map, the kind that had yellowed with age, showing forgotten routes and paths no GPS could pinpoint. We drove past small towns, crossed bridges over creeks that sparkled in the sunlight, and admired the changing colors of the trees. But the farther we went, the quieter it got. The towns grew more spread out, the trees more densely packed, the air heavier. Eventually, we found ourselves on a dirt road, winding up into the mountains. The landscape shifted. The trees growing thicker, the atmosphere thicker, the only sounds now the crunch of the tires over gravel and the occasional bird call. That's when we saw it, a small cabin nestled on the edge of the woods. It wasn't anything special, just a worn structure, sitting alone in the mountainside, but there was something unsettling about it. The windows were cracked, the porch sagging with age, and the roof looked like it hadn't been repaired in decades. But what caught my eye wasn't the cabin itself. It was the faint light flickering from one of the windows. "Is someone there?" I asked, squinting through the windshield. Mike, who had been leading the charge on this adventure, slowed the car, eyeing the cabin. "Could just be the light reflecting off something. We should check it out." Now, I wasn't the paranoid type, but something about that cabin set me on edge. It seemed too out of place, like it had no business being here, like it shouldn't even exist in this part of the woods. But the others were curious, and I didn't want to be the one to back out. We parked the car near the edge of the dirt road and walked toward the cabin, the leaves crunching beneath our feet. As we approached, the air grew colder, heavier. The trees felt like they were pressing in closer, and I could hear the sound of my own breath in the silence. Too loud, too shallow. "Hello?" Mike called, his voice echoing strangely through the still air. "Is anyone here?" We waited for a response. Nothing. We knocked on the door, but it creaked open before we could try the handle. It was as though the place had been expecting us. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the dying glow of a lantern near the corner of the room. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, and the smell of mildew and something else, something I couldn't place, hung heavy in the air. "Anyone home?" I asked, stepping inside. The room was cramped, filled with old furniture that seemed to have been abandoned long ago. There were shelves lined with jars of strange objects and old photographs, their faces faded with age. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, but it was the corner of the room that caught my eye. There, in the dim light, was a large, old rocking chair, and in that chair, someone was sitting. I froze. The figure was still, unmoving, and yet I could feel its presence. Something about the way the light flickered around it made the person look almost unnatural. It wasn't just the dust or the darkness that made it eerie, it was the feeling that came with it, the sense that whoever or whatever was sitting there wasn't alive, not in any real sense. I turned to Mike, but his expression mirrored mine. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. We stood there for a moment, unsure whether to speak or move. Then, in a split second, the rocking chair creaked. Slowly, very slowly, it began to rock back and forth. At first, it was just a gentle movement, but it grew more pronounced, the rhythm becoming more insistent, like someone was trying to get up but couldn't. Then, the figure moved. Not like a person would, no shifting of limbs, no normal movement. It was jerky, like a puppet being controlled by strings. The head tilted at an unnatural angle and the figure looked directly at us. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze, cold and calculating. It stood, and that's when I saw it. The figure's legs didn't move. They stayed straight, rigid, as if the body was being pulled up by invisible strings. It floated a few inches off the ground, its gaze never leaving us. Without thinking, I grabbed Mike's arm. "We need to go, now." We turned, but before we could take a step, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered once more, casting strange shadows across the walls. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, growing larger, more oppressive. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, suffocating, and then it spoke. It wasn't a voice, not in any normal sense. It was more like a feeling, a cold whisper that sent a chill through my bones. The words were unintelligible, a language I couldn't understand, but the meaning came through clearly. Leave now. We didn't need another warning. We rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle rattled, but the door remained shut as if it was sealed from the other side. Behind us, the rocking chair creaked again, and I knew the figure was moving. The feeling in the air changed. The temperature dropped. The silence was broken by the faintest rustling behind us, like footsteps in the dust. I turned around, but nothing was there. The figure was gone. The chair, though, still rocked back and forth in the center of the room, but it was now empty. Mike grabbed me by the sleeve. "We're getting out of here. Now!" I didn't argue. We backed away from the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, following us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door gave way, and we stumbled into the cold night air. We didn't look back. We ran back to the car, jumping inside, slamming the doors shut. Mike didn't even start the engine. He just sat there, his hands shaking on the wheel. We sat in silence for a long time, both of us too afraid to speak. The moment we left that cabin behind, the oppressive weight lifted, and the air felt lighter. But the images of what I'd seen still clung to my mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, but we never spoke of what happened. The trip, the road, the cabin, they faded from our minds as quickly as they'd come. But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear that faint creaking of the rocking chair, and I know, somewhere in the deep woods, the cabin is waiting.
Next story.
I was never one to believe in ghost stories or the supernatural. Growing up, I'd laugh at the ridiculous tales my friends would tell around campfires. My skepticism was rooted in logic, and I dismissed anything that couldn't be explained by science. That is, until I found myself in the heart of the deep woods, and my beliefs were shattered. It all started with an invitation from my cousin Sarah. She had just bought a cabin in a remote area, deep in the Adirondacks. "Come visit. You'll love it," she had said. "It's quiet, peaceful, no distractions, just the forest and a warm fire." That sounded perfect after months of stressful work, and since I had some time off, I agreed to spend the weekend with her. The cabin was more rustic than I expected. It was isolated, situated on a small hill surrounded by dense trees. The only way in was a narrow, winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever, far away from any other people. The kind of place where you could forget the world. The silence was almost oppressive, but in a strange, comforting way. When I arrived, Sarah greeted me warmly, and we spent the first evening catching up over dinner, the fire crackling in the corner. On the second day, Sarah suggested a hike through the woods. It was a clear day, the sun shining through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. We set off, chatting casually as we walked, but soon I realized that the deeper we went into the forest, the more unsettling it became. The trees felt too close, their branches weaving together like they were keeping us contained. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was deadly quiet, as though even the animals knew to stay away. We eventually reached a clearing. In the center was a small, overgrown stone structure. It looked ancient, abandoned. The stones were worn and cracked, and vines had begun to climb over them. There was a strange aura around the place, like it had been forgotten by time itself. It was impossible to tell how old it was, but something about it felt wrong. My instincts kicked in, warning me to leave. Sarah, however, seemed fascinated. "I've never seen this before," she said, stepping closer to inspect the stones. "I didn't know there was anything like this out here." She looked up at me, her expression shifting, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "It's strange, though. I've been coming here for weeks, and I swear I've never seen this clearing before." I stared at her, unsure what to say. It was as though we had just stumbled upon something that had been hidden from us, like the woods didn't want us to find it. The air grew heavy, pressing in on us, making it hard to breathe. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. "We should go," I suggested, my voice tense. But Sarah was already kneeling down to inspect the stones, oblivious to the creeping sense of dread that was growing inside me. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound broke the silence. It wasn't an animal. not anything I could recognize. It was more like a moan, deep and drawn out, a sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. My blood ran cold. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah didn't answer. She was still inspecting the stones, her fingers tracing the surface, lost in whatever odd fascination she had. Then, without warning, she stood up, her face pale. I don't know what this is," she muttered, backing away slowly, "but I don't think we should be here." We turned to leave, but the moment we stepped away from the stone structure, we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the trees behind us. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. "Someone's there," I said, my voice tight with fear. But there was no one. The clearing was empty, the trees standing still and silent as ever. We started walking faster, but the footsteps kept pace with us. Always a few steps behind, but never getting closer. I could feel Sarah's breath quicken beside me, both of us moving faster and faster, but no matter how fast we walked, the footsteps stayed right there, like someone or something was following us. Then, as if from nowhere, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. A tall, gaunt man dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by shadow. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "Sarah?" I whispered, barely able to speak. "We need to get out of here, now." I grabbed her arm and turned, running back toward the cabin, my pulse racing. We didn't stop until we were inside, slamming the door behind us. My chest was heaving and I was shaking uncontrollably. Sarah was staring out the window, her face pale as she peered through the blinds. "They're out there," she murmured. "The footsteps, I don't know who he was." I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, and every part of me screamed that we weren't alone anymore. The atmosphere in the cabin felt oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't the wind I heard. It was the footsteps again, faint but unmistakable, moving around the cabin. I lay frozen in the dark, listening as they circled us, the sound growing louder and closer until it was right outside the window. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The silence was deafening, oppressive. I lay there, wide-eyed, unable to sleep, unable to make sense of anything. The next morning, Sarah was gone. I searched the cabin, called out for her, but there was no sign of her anywhere. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I checked her phone, but it was gone too. The only thing left was a note she had scribbled in a hurried, shaking hand. "I can't stay. It's too late. The forest has claimed me." Panic gripped me. I rushed outside, calling her name, but the woods were silent, still. The same oppressive silence that had surrounded us the day before. I walked through the forest, retracing our steps, but I couldn't find her. I couldn't even find the stone structure we had discovered. I don't know what happened to Sarah that day or who the man was that followed us. I don't know if she's still out there, somewhere, lost to the forest. All I know is that I couldn't stay. I couldn't risk becoming a part of whatever it was that had claimed her. I left that place the next morning, never looking back. The woods have a way of swallowing people whole, of taking them when they least expect it. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear the footsteps again, and I wonder if it's too late for me too.
Next story.
It had been a long, exhausting week. I was overdue for some peace and quiet, away from the noise of the city and the weight of daily responsibilities. So, when my old college buddy Kyle invited me to join him on a weekend getaway to his family's cabin deep in the woods, I couldn't say no. It had been years since we'd hung out, and I figured it would be good to catch up. The cabin, he told me, was tucked away in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. No neighbors for miles, just the quiet of the forest. The perfect place to unwind. Kyle assured me it was a safe, peaceful spot, far from any kind of danger. He'd been going there since he was a kid. The drive took hours, the road winding through thick forests and past long stretches of empty fields. As we neared the cabin, the trees grew taller, their branches intertwining above us, casting the car in a constant shadow. The air felt cooler as we pulled up to the cabin, an old, wooden structure that looked like it had been there for generations. The kind of place that was both charming and eerie, with a porch that sagged under the weight of time and a roof that looked like it hadn't been repaired in years. "Welcome to the family cabin," Kyle said with a grin. "Not much to look at, but it gets the job done." I smiled, trying to shake off the creeping feeling that this place might be more than I bargained for. The woods were quiet, too quiet, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. We unloaded the car, settled into the cabin, and spent the evening reminiscing, drinking a few beers, and enjoying the stillness that surrounded us. As the night wore on, Kyle and I decided to take a walk around the property. The moon was barely visible through the thick canopy of trees, and the air had grown colder. Kyle was telling stories about his childhood, how he used to wander these woods for hours with his brothers, and how they once heard strange noises that no one could explain. I laughed it off at first, but there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. We walked a little further from the cabin, and then we heard it. A sound. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't a bear, that was for sure. The growl was too deep, too primal. Kyle froze in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, this time closer. It was like something was moving through the woods, something big, something watching us. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. "Kyle," I said, my voice shaky, "we should go back to the cabin." "Yeah, let's not stick around to find out what it is," he agreed, his eyes scanning the trees nervously. We turned and started heading back toward the cabin, but the growl followed us. It was getting closer, the sound of it moving through the underbrush, sending a chill down my spine. I could feel my breath quickening as panic started to set in. Whatever it was huge, and it wasn't afraid to let us know it was there. Just as we reached the clearing near the cabin, there was a rustling in the trees behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing there. Still, the air felt wrong, thick, charged, like something was waiting for us in the dark. "Kyle, I don't like this. We need to get inside now," I urged. Kyle was already halfway to the door. "Yeah, you're right. Something's not right out here." We rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind us. We locked the door, but the feeling of unease lingered. The growl, though faint now, still echoed in my mind, a reminder of the danger we'd felt in those woods. Kyle and I sat in silence, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. But then something changed. The floorboards creaked. A slow, deliberate sound, as if someone, was walking around in the attic above us. Kyle and I exchanged uneasy glances. The cabin was old, sure, but the sound didn't feel like the usual creaks from settling wood. This was something else. I could hear it moving above us, circling the room. It sounded too heavy to be an animal, and the pacing wasn't random. It was methodical, like it knew we were there, like it was toying with us. I stood up, my legs shaking. "Kyle, we have to check it out. It's not safe in here." Kyle looked pale. "Are you out of your mind? We can't go up there. Whatever that is, whatever's up there, it's not something we want to mess with." But I couldn't just sit there. The fear inside me was too strong, too real. I grabbed a flashlight, and Kyle reluctantly followed me as we crept toward the stairs that led to the attic. The air in the cabin felt colder, and the silence outside seemed to have swallowed the world whole. The sound above us had stopped, and now there was only the pounding of my own heart. We reached the attic door, and I hesitated for just a moment before twisting the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. I flicked the flashlight on and stepped inside. The beam of light swept across the dusty floor, but there was no sign of anything unusual. At least, that's what I thought. Then I saw it. A shadow in the corner. A dark, formless shape that seemed to ripple and shift as if it weren't entirely real. It hovered just out of the light's reach, and when I moved closer, it moved too, staying just on the edge of the beam. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Kyle didn't answer. He was frozen, his face drained of color, his eyes wide with terror. I turned the light back to the corner, but the shadow was gone. In its place was something worse. A figure. Tall, thin, hunched, its limbs long and twisted in a grotesque way, as if it had been distorted by the darkness itself. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were glowing, an unnatural, sickly green that pierced through the darkness. It didn't speak, didn't move, but it watched us, its gaze heavy and cold. Before I could react, the figure lunged. I stumbled backward, grabbing Kyle, and we bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind us. We didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Kyle didn't say a word on the drive back. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. I could barely speak, my breath coming in short gasps. When we finally reached the nearest town, we stopped at a gas station and I looked at Kyle. Uh, what the hell was that? He swallowed hard. I don't know, but my family's, there's something in those woods. There's something that's been there long before the cabin was built. I couldn't speak after that. The weight of the night hung over me, and all I could think about was that figure, waiting in the shadows. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think Kyle will either. There are some places in the woods that are better left unexplored, some things that are better left unseen.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts, not until that night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented an old farmhouse upstate, looking for a quiet place to relax and get away from the noise of city life. The farmhouse was isolated, nestled in the middle of a vast expanse of farmland, the kind of place you could hear your own thoughts. We all agreed it was the perfect spot. But the moment we arrived, there was something off about it. The house looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The front door creaked as I opened it, and the air inside was musty, as if no one had lived there for a long time. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Still, we shrugged it off. It added to the charm, right? A bit of rustic character. That first night, we sat around the kitchen table laughing and drinking wine, enjoying the quiet. The wind howled outside, the trees rattling against the windows. Everything seemed normal until the power went out. It wasn't a stormy night, no rain or lightning, just the sudden flicker of the lights followed by complete darkness. At first, we thought it was a simple power failure, but then we realized something wasn't right. We fumbled for our phones, but the signal was gone. Not a single bar. Weird, said Rachel, one of my friends, as she tried to turn on her flashlight app. But her phone wouldn't work either. It was as if the house had a power all its own. We could still hear the wind, but it felt wrong. The sound outside was muffled, almost too still. Well, this is great, said Max, trying to make a joke of it. Guess we're going old school. Let's light some candles. We gathered a few candles from the kitchen drawers, and the faint flicker of their flames filled the room with an eerie glow. Everyone sat back down at the table, trying to ignore the strange unease that had settled over us. That's when we heard it, a soft tapping sound from upstairs. At first, we thought it was just the old house settling, but the sound repeated, deliberate, measured, like someone was walking slowly, deliberately, tapping their feet on the wooden floor. Did you guys hear that? Rachel asked, her voice trembling slightly. We all listened. Nothing, just the wind. The house was quiet again. I don't hear anything, Max said, trying to brush it off. But the tapping came again. Closer this time, we all froze. There was no way anyone was up there. The house was supposed to be empty, just the four of us. That's not normal, I muttered, my heart racing. I'm going upstairs to check, Max said, getting up from the table. He was trying to act brave, but I could see his hands shaking as he picked up a flashlight and started toward the stairs. I followed behind him, the others trailing nervously. The stairwell creaked beneath our weight, and with every step, the sound of the tapping grew louder. It was coming from the second floor. When we reached the top of the stairs, the air felt colder, almost frigid. The hallway stretched out in front of us, dark and oppressive, the only light coming from the flickering candles downstairs. The tapping was more pronounced now, echoing down the hall. Max cautiously walked down the hallway, and we followed, our feet barely making a sound on the creaky floorboards. He reached a door at the end of the hallway, one we hadn't noticed before. It looked old, like it hadn't been opened in years. The tapping came from behind it. Hello? Max called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, just the tapping, now incessant, almost frantic. Max reached for the doorknob, and when he turned it, the door creaked open on its own, as if it hadn't been latched. We all stepped into the room together. It was small, barely more than a storage space, but what we saw inside froze us in place. The room was covered in dust, the floor littered with old furniture covered in white sheets, but what stood out was the old rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, ever so slightly, rocking back and forth as if someone was sitting in it. But the chair was empty. We all stared at it, frozen. The tapping sound had stopped, but the chair kept rocking, moving in that slow, rhythmic motion. This is messed up, Rachel whispered, backing away from the room. We need to leave, right now. But I couldn't move. Something was pulling me toward the chair. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, a pressure that didn't belong. "Get out of there," Max shouted, grabbing my arm, pulling me toward the door. I snapped out of it and turned, running out of the room with the others. We didn't stop until we were downstairs, back in the dim light of the kitchen. But we couldn't escape the feeling. The house wasn't empty. Something was here with us. We gathered our things in a panic, no longer caring about the weekend getaway. We had to leave. As we grabbed our bags and ran to the car, I felt it again. The weight, the presence, just behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. We didn't speak about it on the drive back, the silence in the car deafening. The sound of the wind howling against the windows felt like a warning, but none of us said a word about it. When we finally reached the town, we stopped at a gas station, desperate for a moment to breathe. The gas station attendant, a grizzled man with a thick accent, eyed us curiously. "Where are you folks coming from?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "The old farmhouse," Max said, trying to sound casual. The man's expression changed. He looked over his shoulder, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Y'all stay away from that place," he said, his eyes wide with something unspoken. "There's stories about people who go in and never come back. No one stays there for long. Some things, they don't let you leave." The words hung in the air like a curse, heavy and unspoken. We didn't ask him what he meant. We didn't need to. We knew. And as I sat in the car, staring out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us, just out of sight. The presence from the farmhouse, the tapping in the walls, the empty rocking chair. It wasn't over. Not yet.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, my brother, and a few friends in the middle of nowhere. We had chosen a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the beaten path, hoping for a peaceful weekend of fishing, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. The kind of place where the stars seem brighter and the air smells cleaner. But that was before the fire started. It was our second night camping, and we had just finished dinner around the campfire. We were talking and joking, as you do on these kinds of trips, when my brother Josh brought up a local legend we'd heard about earlier. "Did you guys hear about the old man of Blackwood?" he asked, the flickering light of the fire casting strange shadows across his face. We all nodded. The story was well known in the area, a tale about a hermit who had lived in the woods decades ago, a man so reclusive that no one ever really knew what happened to him. Some said he'd gone mad, others said he'd been murdered by a group of travelers who had gotten lost in the forest. But the most chilling part of the legend was that the old man never left the woods. Not in death. Josh laughed, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "They say if you're out here long enough, you'll see him, just out of the corner of your eye, standing in the trees, watching you. And if you stare too long, he'll come for you." My friends chuckled nervously, and we all brushed it off as the usual ghost story banter, but I noticed something about the way Josh said it. He didn't seem to be joking. There was an unease in his voice, an edge that made my spine tingle. We stayed around the fire a little longer before heading to our tents for the night. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rustling of trees in the wind. I couldn't sleep. It was that silence. It was suffocating. My mind raced, and every little noise sent my heart racing. Was it an animal, a person? I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to block it all out, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, just outside my tent. I froze. My pulse quickened as I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too heavy, too human. The footsteps circled around my tent, like someone was inspecting it, or worse, watching me. I grabbed my flashlight, preparing to call out, but before I could make a sound, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, tense and trembling, but nothing happened. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go outside and risk whatever was out there, but I couldn't just stay in the tent either. The paranoia was eating away at me. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was creeping into the tent. But when I opened my eyes, my blood turned to ice. There was something in the doorway of my tent, a shape, a figure. A man standing just outside, obscured by the shadows, but I could see the outline. Tall, thin, with something hanging from his hands. A long, ragged coat, tattered at the edges. A face that was too pale, too still. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I just stared at him, and for a moment everything felt like it was in slow motion. I didn't know if he had seen me or if he was even real. But then he moved, not toward me, but away from the tent, disappearing into the trees. I waited a long time before I dared to get out. I had to check on the others. But when I crawled out of my tent, the camp was empty. My brother, my friends, gone. The fire was nothing but a few cold embers, and there was no trace of anyone. Panic set in. I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness, but no one responded. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I searched the campsite, hoping it was some kind of sick joke, but there was no sign of them. No tracks, no personal items left behind. I stumbled toward the woods, thinking maybe they had gone hiking or gotten lost. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees twisted unnaturally, and the silence was deafening. There were no birds, no wind, nothing. Hours passed. Or maybe it was days. Time had no meaning anymore. I don't know how long I wandered, but when the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself at the edge of a clearing. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the clearing, there was an old cabin, run down, decaying, and forgotten by time. I didn't know how I hadn't seen it before. The cabin seemed to pulse with something dark, like it was alive, breathing. My feet carried me toward it before I could stop myself. The door was ajar, and the smell of rot wafted from inside. I stepped over the threshold, and that's when I heard it, the voice. Faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, but growing louder. Welcome home. I spun around, heart pounding, but the door had slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. There, in the corner of the room, stood the man, the old man. He was no longer just a silhouette. He was real, standing in the shadows watching me. His eyes were hollow, empty, like the black void of space itself. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. You're mine now, all of you. I ran. I don't know how, but I did. I broke through the door, running through the dark woods, branches slapping my face, the air thick with dread. The voice followed me, echoing in my mind, growing louder. You can't leave. I don't know how I made it out of the woods, but when I finally found my way back to the road, I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I just kept running. I never went back to that forest, and I never saw my brother or my friends again. Some nights, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear his voice in my head. You're mine now. And that's when I realize he was never talking to them.
Next story.
I've always been the kind of person who likes to explore places that most people avoid. Abandoned buildings, old graveyards, remote towns, anything that others would find unsettling, I found fascinating. So when I stumbled upon a small, isolated town in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't resist checking it out. It wasn't on any map I had, and the locals I spoke to hadn't heard of it. But there it was, just off a forgotten dirt road. The town was called Wraith Hollow. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate streets. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. At first glance, Wraith Hollow appeared abandoned. Boarded up windows, empty streets, and crumbling houses that looked like they hadn't seen life in decades. But something felt wrong. Even as I parked my car and stepped out, I felt eyes on me. I tried to shake off the feeling. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, it was a quiet old town, and I was used to seeing places like this. But as I wandered through the streets, I noticed something strange. There were no sounds. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind. Just complete and eerie silence. The only thing that broke it was the creak of an old swing set in the distance, moving back and forth slowly as if being pushed by an invisible hand. Curious, I followed the sound until I found myself in a small park. The swing set was the only thing in the park that looked even remotely intact. The swings swayed gently in the still air, and I couldn't help but stare at them for a moment, as if entranced. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint but clear, coming from behind me. Why are you here? I spun around, my heart racing, but no one was there. The park was empty. I stood still for a moment, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe I was imagining things. But as I turned back to the swings, I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt beneath them. Small, childlike footprints, as if someone had just been here. But there was no one around. I had to get out of there. This place was starting to feel wrong. But as I turned to leave, I noticed a house at the edge of the park. Unlike the others, this one was well maintained, though it looked strange, like it had been built in a different era. The windows were dark, but there was a light flickering from inside, as though someone was there. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the house and knocked on the door. No one answered. I knocked again, a little louder this time, but still no response. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open slightly, as though someone had been standing behind it. "Hello?" I called out, but no answer came. I pushed the door open cautiously and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, but there was a strange warmth to it, like the house had been recently occupied. The furniture was old but well kept, and the walls were lined with old photographs. They all seemed to be of the same family, a man, a woman, and a child. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. In every photo, the child's eyes were scratched out. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine, but the longer I stayed in the house, the more unsettled I became. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard it again. The faint voice. "Why did you come here?" This time, the voice was much closer, as if it was standing right behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. I turned and ran out of the house, like my breath coming in short gasps. The silence of the town was overwhelming, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger the further I went. I stumbled back toward my car, desperate to leave, but when I reached the spot where I had parked, my stomach dropped. My car was gone. Panic surged through me as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of it. How could it just vanish? I was sure I had parked it right here. I checked the street, the empty lot, but there was nothing. Just the empty, silent town. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the street, in the window of an old abandoned house, I saw a figure, a silhouette of a child, standing perfectly still, staring at me from behind the glass. Its face was obscured by the reflection, but I could see the shape, small, thin, and unnaturally still. I didn't know how, but I knew the child was watching me. And it wasn't just the child. There were others. Shadows moved in the windows of other houses, peering out from behind the curtains, watching me with silent, unblinking eyes. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, following me down the street, but when I looked back, no one was there. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, my lungs burning from the exertion. But when I looked back, Wraith Hollow was gone. The town, everything, had vanished. All that was left was an empty stretch of road leading into the woods. I've never spoken about what happened that night. I don't think anyone would believe me. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that the town is still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to wander too close. Because once you find Wraith Hollow, it doesn't let you leave.